Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. This time I'm going to be showcasing my Sega Genesis collection. I'm actively collecting for Genesis. I don't buy a ton of them, ton of games all the time, but I am actively collecting for the Genesis, for the Sega Saturn, and the Sega CD. I'm not really much of a collector when it comes to Nintendo. So anyway, I've had the Sega Genesis since I graduated from 8th grade. It was an 8th grade graduation present. Now, this was a couple years after the Genesis originally came out. Because, I was more of a Nintendo fan. I liked Nintendo games. But even back then, I've noticed that, that Genesis had games that, I never even heard of. And they seemed so interesting to me. But, since I had Nintendo, and then soon after that I had Super Nintendo, I was like, well, I don't think I could get a Genesis. I don't think I would want anything to do with Genesis. But eventually I did. I remember the first time I played a Genesis was obviously over a friend's house. I think that's how it starts for most of us. This is how we get introduced to these video game systems and why we get them and all that stuff. But I was introduced to it early on when it first came out, when it had these type of backgrounds on their boxes, I guess the grid, classic Genesis, right? And I remember when Altered Beast was the pack-in game with the Sega Genesis before Sonic the Hedgehog became the pack-in game. I got it when Sonic the Hedgehog was the pack-in game, but before that, it came with a game called Altered Beast. Obviously, I don't have it because now I'm on the seas, but I don't have Altered Beast. I played it. It was all right, But anyway, I first was introduced to Genesis at a friend's house. Now, that was when I realized, like, wow, a lot of these games. I enjoyed the graphics because I was introduced to the Genesis before the Super Nintendo had come out. So the graphics on the Genesis were superior to regular Nintendo. So that caught my eye immediately. I remember the Sega Genesis commercials, the early ones, the benign ones, before they started attacking Nintendo. I think a lot of people, when they remember the Sega Genesis commercials, they remember the aggressive commercials where they were comparing their games, Sonic the Hedgehog, to Mario Kart, and a bunch of other things. But I remember the Genesis commercials before that, before they got obnoxious, when they were showcasing games like this right here, Ghouls and Ghosts. And I was like, oh, wow. Is that like the sequel to Ghosts and Goblins? And yeah, it was. In a way. So I was impressed. And I remember one of the first times I played the Genesis, I played the original Golden Axe. I don't have the original Golden Axe. But this was one of the first games I got for the Genesis because I remember Golden Axe was one of the games I first played and I enjoyed it. And they had Golden Axe 2 out at the time when I first got it. I was like, ooh, maybe I should get that. And I remember the commercials for games like Streets of Rage, and in this one, in particular right here, Kid Chameleon. So I just said, yeah, this is definitely something I would like to get, and I eventually got it. Now, my friend Joe was a big Genesis player. But he got the Genesis. He got the Genesis for graduation too. But he was mainly into sports games. He wasn't into the games that I was into, like platformers and action adventure and stuff like that. So he got the Genesis and he played all the Madden games and all the baseball games and all that stuff. There are still some games that I have that I just don't know where they are. They were lost over the years. Some of the earlier games I had Sports Talk Baseball, and to name one. But I don't know whatever happened to it. I didn't like it. I mean, it was okay, but, I just got it to maybe play with a friend. But it wasn't that good. But anyway, when it comes back to Joe, this game right here, Mortal Kombat, I'm sure everyone knows what Mortal Kombat is. I'm sure everyone's heard the story about Mortal Kombat on the Genesis and all that. The Genesis version was the superior version over the Super Nintendo. It was superior for a number of reasons. First off, it had the blood. You punch in a code at the title screen or whatever it was, and you could use the blood. Secondly, although the graphics were not nearly as good on the Genesis, or at least I thought, as they were on the Super Nintendo. That also includes the music, because most of the time the Genesis music wasn't as good, but I'll get into that in a few moments. But that version of Mortal Kombat was so much better. It played so much better. It was faster on the Genesis. It was just great. And then the Super Nintendo suffered because of it, I think. They released, the more toned down version of Mortal Kombat, and wasn't as good. But I was introduced to that game through my friend Joe. He called me one day, because he knew I liked fighting games. I was into Street Fighter 2 and all that stuff. He called me one day, and he said, "Hey, did you play this game called Mortal Kombat?" I said, "No, I heard of it though, because I was comic book fan, and Mortal Kombat was on the back of the Wizard magazines." And I said, "Oh yeah, I've heard of it." He says, "Oh, you got to get this. This is really, really cool. It's better than Street Fighter, I think." And I was like, "Really?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." He piqued my interest, so I wound up getting Mortal Kombat for the Super Nintendo, and I was like, playing it. I was like, Joe's got to be. This had to have been a joke. This game is not nearly as good as Street Fighter. The controls were kind of clunky. It just didn't play too well. But then I found out about the blood and all that stuff, and I was like, oh, okay. And that's when I went and got the Genesis version. I was like, okay, this game is much better. It plays better, and all the other things I said a few moments ago. But that was the case with some of the games on Genesis and Super Nintendo. Yes, some games came out simultaneously. They came out for both systems, right? Like Mortal Kombat, like Earthworm Jim, which I showed earlier in the video. But sometimes the Genesis version, for this reason or that reason, sometimes the Genesis version was better. Maybe it was the play control. Graphics were usually the same, but in some cases, now I mentioned the music. Now the Sega Genesis did not have the superior music chip from Sony that the Super Nintendo had. Yes, Sony, I think I mentioned this in a previous video. Sony and Nintendo were partnered up. They were going to release something called the Nintendo PlayStation, but Nintendo backed out, which was one of the biggest blunders in video game history. But Sony made the music chips that were installed in all the Super Nintendos. That's why they had superior sound. And the Genesis kind of had, not the best sound. Whenever there was a sound effect, it wasn't always as crisp. Whenever there was a voice, the voice sounded like it had a sore throat. But there were times, and like I'm getting back to the Earthworm Jim comparison, that the music had this metal, grungy type sound to it and made it seem more intense and cooler to the ear to listen than the Super Nintendo. And that was one of the cases. There are probably many other cases out there where the music was a little bit better than the Super Nintendo, but I don't know too many of them. But like I said, the music wasn't the best, but the Genesis did have its own unique sound, which is appealing. Which is appealing to a lot of people, a lot of fans. Now, I remember those commercials with the Genesis, how Genesis does what Nintendo don't. I remember them when they came out. I thought they were funny. As a Nintendo fan, even though I had the Genesis, I always tended to side with Nintendo. Like I said with Mortal Kombat. Oh, Mortal Kombat's out? I'll get it for the Super Nintendo. Earthworm Jim? I'll get it for the Super Nintendo. Zombies Ate My Neighbors? I'll get it for the Super Nintendo. But I found those commercials amusing. I really did. I remember when they first started coming out, I was like, am I supposed to be offended? But it was all in good fun. I mean, I miss that type of advertising today. I really do. I mean, I don't think you're going to get away with something like that today because, everyone's so offended at every little thing. People, corporations, politicians, all that stuff. No one has a backbone anymore. But it does bring you back, this whole these classic games, whether it's Super Nintendo or Genesis, Sega CD. It does bring you back to a different time when gaming was maybe a little more simple, had a great future when it comes to graphics and development, and how it was just fun to be a gamer. Everything seems so complicated nowadays. And here's my last game. Great game. X-Men Clone Wars. Well, that's my Sega Genesis collection. Like I said, I'm still collecting for it. If I ever get a substantial amount of games, I'll make another updated collection video, but I don't think you're going to see that for a long time. But thank you all for watching, and take care.